Spiritual abuse is complex, and it comes with a lot of questions. Healing from spiritual abuse comes with a lot of questions too. And in today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast, we ask a lot of those tough questions and attempt to answer them as well with today's guest, multi-time author, theologian, professor of New Testament, and one of my personal heroes, Scott McKnight. Now, if you've never heard of Scott McKnight, he's written recent books like A Church Called Tove and Pivot. And we actually had his daughter and co-author of those two books, Laura Barringer, on the podcast not too long ago. But Scott has written a lot more books than just those two. He's actually written more books than I can count on my fingers and my toes. Scott's one of the smartest guys I've ever met, and he is an avid advocate for spiritual abuse victims. He's someone who stands up for what is right and stands against what is wrong, even when it's unpopular. And we dive deep into some of those uncomfortable and complex questions in this episode. We talk about everything from the power dynamics that are involved in spiritual abuse, what we can realistically expect to happen when someone takes a stand against spiritual abuse, and what are some of the dark and kind of seedy reasons why spiritual abuse happens so often in the church today. This was an incredible conversation with Scott McKnight. I know it encouraged me. I think you're going to like it as well. So if you're ready to dive into today's episode, let's get going with the Church Disrupted podcast. All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. And today we've got a conversation that I've been excited about for a really long time. Because this is one of those situations where I get to have a conversation with a sort of hero of mine who never knew that's who he was. That's what he was. But today we get to talk with author, theologian, and just an incredible man of God who has stood up for spiritual abuse victims really for the long haul now, in Scott McKnight. And Scott, we are so glad that you're able to join us today. People loved from our audience the interview that we actually had with Laura. For those that don't know, Laura is Scott's daughter. They co-wrote Pivot in a book called Tove together. But Scott, for those that don't know you, because I've been following a lot of your work for a while, you've written a lot more than just Pivot and a book called Tove. Tell people a little bit more about you and kind of how you got into this space of advocating for spiritual abuse victims and teaching churches how to build a Tove culture.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's good to be with you, and I'm glad you got to talk to Laura. We have very similar ideas, obviously. We've worked them out together. I've been a professor of New Testament for over 4 decades, and so I've been working with potential pastors, church leaders, and lay people, as well as pastors who tend to be some of my best friends for most of those years, but especially the last 25, 30 years. And then Laura and her husband, Mark, were attending Willow Creek, and they were dating one another at the time. They weren't husband and wife. Chris and I decided that we would go to Willow Creek on Saturday evenings so that we could see Laura and Mark as they were dating. We'd go out to eat, we'd talk. And so we got involved in Willow Creek, and we were attenders for about 10 years. I did a little bit of speaking on Wednesday evenings, but not much. And then when the story broke, we had left, and we were at an Anglican church, and Laura and Mark were stunned, as we were, but we began to process this together. And Laura, and I suppose Mark, this isn't really a part of the story, Laura was not treated very well by some of the people that had been her friends at Willow Creek. And so that exacerbated the story for her and sort of traumatized her. And then we began to study this, and Laura was a bit of a pest. That's the word I use for her. She bugged me to write about it. Eventually, I wrote a blog post about it, that went viral. It went viral at Willow as well. I heard about it from all over the world. And then I wrote a couple more blog posts. The story came out in the New York Times that just kind of put everything into clarity. And Bill Hybels left the church. And then I was reading a book. This is the truth. I was reading a book about how the German pastors responded to their responsibility for the Holocaust, and they denied everything.
Wow.
And it was stunning for me. But the real oddity for me was that the very maneuvers, moves, decisions, etc., that these pastors were making were the same decisions that I was seeing in Roman Catholic priests in the United States, Southern Baptist pastors in the United States, and at Willow Creek. So I started taking notes, and it ended up becoming a chapter in a church called Tove called False Narratives. Although we added one later from not Chuck DeGroat, who's the guy who's anyway. We added another section later, but by and large, that's where the book began. And I told Laura at the time, I don't want to write a book about these churches. I want to write a book about the culture of these churches, and I want the book to be redemptive. So we started talking to a publisher. We were offered a contract, and we wrote A Church Called Tove, and it did so very well. We wrote a second book that sort of follows up and gives, the one pastor, Steve Carter, has called it, the first book tells us what, and Pivot tells us how. Mm-hmm. So that's been the process of how we got involved in this. I'm a New Testament professor, and I pushed against writing any of these kinds of books because I told Laura I have plenty to do. I was working on a book on Revelation at the time, and that's now published. It's called, it's about the political message of the book of Revelation, Revelation for the rest of us. So that's been sort of the journey of these books.
Yeah. And you've written quite a few books. How many books have you written total now?
I learned a lesson when I was in college from King David, although I'm not King David, obviously, not to count things. But my wife does count, and it's over 90 now. So
over
I do know
90. That. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your work. I know it's been influential, not just for me, but for others. We have an online community, and last night I was talking to some people, and I let them know. I said, "Hey, actually, I'm going to be interviewing Scott McKnight tomorrow. If any of you have any questions, because there's a couple that I know are just really big fans of your work. Some of your books have made huge impacts in their life outside of the spiritual abuse that they've experienced, and it was kind of such a fanboy type moment that they struggled to come up with questions because they were so excited that you were going to be on the podcast. I just appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you.
Even looking into things when I first started trying to see how deep the rabbit hole went on things like NDAs. I remember, finding some different interviews and stuff with you on those, and I have just appreciated your wisdom over the years with this stuff of caring deeply for the church, wanting to see a healthy church, wanting to see churches with Tove cultures, and not just burning down the system, not just wanting to fix the problem. So I appreciate the wisdom you bring and the balance with that. When we talk about spiritual abuse, because we're going to talk all around that today, we're going to talk about some sides of spiritual abuse that my audience is probably not used to hearing as well. But anytime we talk to people, I like to ask them to kind of just in their own words, define spiritual abuse. What is spiritual abuse to you? And I know you defined it in books. I've got definitions that I love, but just in conversation, as we say, hey, here's kind of what this term means to me, I think it helps to set the foundation for the conversation. So when you think about spiritual abuse in churches today and people going through spiritual abuse, what is it that you're thinking of, and kind of how do you define that in your spirit?
Yeah, it's a discipline that is in the process of development into clarity, and people are discussing this. But Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys in England. Lisa wrote her dissertation on this very topic. So she has a more analytical, long-winded, you could say, definition of spiritual
Yeah.
abuse.
That's the
But I
definition we
think
use, but it is very long.
it is long, yeah, and there's some really important points. But for me, it is when there is an asymmetrical relationship between someone with spiritual authority in a person's life over another person, um, that they use in a way that traumatizes. Now, this is a word that I haven't used in defining spiritual abuse before,
Mm-hmm.
that traumatizes the person under them in a way that is, in a sense, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually wounding.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be an asymmetry of power. It has to be a spiritual relationship. And there has to be an act of something done that traumatizes a person. In general, we would say it is a repeated act rather than a single time. Someone might get angry one time, and that might not be spiritual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
It could be in a bit. But and we're also, I think, looking for a bit of a pattern. Does this person generally do this with other people, or is this just a one-time person? I'm in consultation at times with let's say denominational leaders in churches, and there is a case going on in my conversations about a pastor who seems to be, let's say, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, people just adore the guy. But every now and then, there's someone that he works with who's under him that just that doesn't work out, and neither, let's just say,
Mm-hmm.
the pastor doesn't handle it well, and it becomes abusive to the people. So there is a sense in which abuse is perceptive. It's perceptional. Um, in other words, most pastors who abuse other people spiritually do not intend to abuse them. Some of them do, but they
Mm-hmm.
don't. But they don't intend it. But the impact, we have to distinguish between intent and impact in abuse situations. The impact is abusive, um, and those are the sorts of categories that I use in defining it. But trauma, I think trauma studies help this because trauma studies discusses trauma as an incident, event, a relationship, a moment that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. That's what spiritual abuse is about. It overwhelms the person. And Jeff, there's another side to this that is important, I believe, and that is it doesn't necessarily show up immediately. It can
Yeah.
take time. I was dealing with a young woman the other day. Well, she's not young. She's in her 40s, I think. She's young for me. She
I appreciate you calling people in their 40s young.
there you go.
Makes me feel good.
Um, she experienced something about 10 years ago that over time has festered into a consciousness that it was actually abusive, and it harmed her and wounded her for 10 years. And she's now, seeing a therapist and working things out. So that's sort of how I would define uh, spiritual abuse.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard, because anytime somebody talks about, Lisa and Justin's definition, one of the things I think that almost everybody will say is, "Hey, it's long and it's detailed." Yet I find most of the time, when we ask that question, our answers become long and detailed because spiritual abuse is something that it can feel really slippery. It can feel really
Mm-hmm.
hard to get our hands on and to get our hearts around and our minds around. And I appreciate you telling the story of the person who years later was realizing this was spiritual abuse. One of the things that we run into in a lot of our conversations with people in our community is they didn't realize they were in an abusive situation for years and years and years, and then finally did while still in the situation. But that awareness altogether, it's what therapists would call flooding. Now they can't think straight. They can't see straight. They don't know how to react. And the smallest things almost begin to set them into a spiral. So when we start unpacking this with people, I kind of give the illustration of having just this ball of tangled stuff in your gut, this slippery, slimy, tangled stuff in your gut. And what we got to do is we got to kind of unravel the threads of where this abuse started and unravel it over time. But I think that's important for audience members to hear and to know is it's okay if you didn't realize it was spiritual abuse in the first place, right? It's okay if it takes you a little while to realize that. And I think sometimes, Scott, there's almost a guilt. If I didn't realize it was spiritual abuse in the first place, then is something wrong with me? Am I just trying to get back at people if I call it what it is later? But I've also noticed that if we don't call it what it is, if we don't tell the truth about the story we've been through, it can really make it hard to heal. Why do you think, just as you kind of look at people's experiences like that, what are some things you see that you think cause that makes it so hard for us to recognize spiritual abuse? Not just the person who's gone through it. Sometimes it's hard for family members, but even when a person realizes I've been through spiritual abuse, we need to address this. A lot of times other people in the congregation who they've loved and they've known and they've done life with have a hard time seeing it or believing it. So what are some things you think of that make it so difficult for us to actually see and understand spiritual abuse as abusive practices?
This is really an important part of what's going on. And that is spiritual leaders have authority in our lives at some level, whether we recognize it or not. They have some authority, and they are trusted. And they are trusted even when they have to say hard things to people. Now, not everybody accepts hard things. Some people immediately fight back. Okay, and that might not be good either. But because they have spiritual authority and because leadership involves making difficult decisions about people, sometimes they have to make difficult decisions that is their proper authority. I was talking to a pastor the other day, and the pastor's made some decisions that other people in the church don't agree with very much. I just lost my camera.
Yeah, I lost you for a minute, but I got you back.
Okay. And they had to make decisions, and it's their right to make those decisions, and it's okay. So that's one side of it. But I think the other side of it is that people in churches are naturally, incurably, probably for the good overall, trusting of pastors, and they believe what they say. The result of which, at times, pastors can abuse their authority and people won't say a word because they think it was legit, because that pastor's got authority and that pastor's godly and that person mediates God to me over and over. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is our experience with whistleblowers, with anybody who brings, let's say, an allegation against a pastor, is that they are not believed. My wife reads about this stuff far more than I do. I study it and then stay away from it because I'm working on other things. I think she would say close to 95% of people in the church are going to believe the pastor's side of the story rather than the whistleblower side of the story. So it's created a culture in which anybody who has an allegation is scared to death to bring it out because they know they're going to be distrusted. Furthermore, they probably are going to be gaslit at some level. They're going to be disagreed with. They're going to be silenced, and they're probably going to lose their friends. So it's created a culture in which people just are afraid to bring these things forward. And this is, I would say, Jeff, this is an undeniable reality of what's going on in churches when it comes to bringing forward some allegations.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I've seen, I would love to see if you kind of see it the same way or maybe differently, because different perspectives always help. But even looking at my own journey, when we hear these stories every single day of you know people who have went through different kinds of spiritual abuse, but whether it's my own journey or their stories, one of the things I hear a ton, Scott, is as I'm hearing them talk about what wounded them most, it almost feels like what wounds us most is the second wound.
Yeah.
You have experts that talk about the second wound, but the second wound in spiritual abuse seems to be um, how the church and people that you trusted and people who were friends, how people respond to it. That can almost be, from my experience, more damaging than the original abuse. Do you see that with stories that you've heard, victims that you've worked with, or do you see it in a different way?
Um, I agree with you 100%. And as you know, let's just say I agree with you 95%. As if it is true that between 90 and 95%, in our experience, nearly every situation where someone brings an allegation, most of the people in the church believe the pastor and the church's narrative about what happened. So that um, when the church then turns against the victim, it is a re-victimization, but it is a deeper victimization because it is not just a spiritual authority or the leaders in a church. Let's just say it's 6 of them. It becomes close friends. It gets all wrapped up with betrayal and friendship
Yeah.
and histories and children's relationship. And now you can't go to church anymore because you are now experiencing a rejection at a pervasive level that you didn't think possible. So it's not simply re-traumatizing the original trauma. It is a widening and deepening of trauma itself. That's
Mm.
what we. That's what I would. That's how I would describe what happens.
Hey, Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. Yeah, that's a good word. One of the things that you've talked about already today that I think is something we have to talk more about when it comes to spiritual abuse is you can't really have spiritual abuse without a dichotomy of power, right? An imbalance of power. You mentioned that a minute ago. What is it about the imbalance of power and pastors having spiritual authority over people that makes spiritual abuse so damaging? And I asked that question as well, Scott, as someone who spent 17 years in local church ministry. I've had those times where I've abused unintentionally. I had to go back and apologize for that. I've had to make apologies much longer later as I realized I didn't think that was spiritual abuse at the time, but it was. But the power dynamic always plays a role in that. So there's really 2 parts to this question. One, what is it about the power imbalance and the power dynamic that makes spiritual abuse so damaging? But the second part of this question is, how would you recommend that people respond when they see spiritual abuse? Whether that's, I've been a victim of spiritual abuse, I'm trying to stand up for myself, or it could be the person who sees what they think is spiritual abuse with another parishioner. It could be the staff member, even on church, that sees that. What are ways that we can healthily respond to spiritual abuse to try to stand against that behavior when there is a dichotomy of power? Because oftentimes the abuse is going to happen when people who have a lot more power than us, even if we're on staff.
Power does power. Power abuses. Power has the capacity to overwhelm another person's capacity to cope. So it's always about power. Even when it's almost equals, it can be about power. It's someone can assert power in a situation that, let's just say, is not authorized to have that power. So, you can have power that way. But the response to this, here's what we've learned, Jeff. This is critical. We've learned from this book, A Church Called Tove, that we have given people language to describe their experience that they did not know how to describe. So the first thing I think we need is education, just basic information and perception of what spiritual abuse is, so that when people experience it, they'll be able to name it. So I think a book like ours, or Chuck DeGroat, or Wade Mullen's book, or even Diane Langberg's book, these books give people language to describe their own experiences. I would say 100 people at least in the last year have told me or have told Laura that A Church Called Tove gave them language to describe their experience. The number of the letters that we got the first year, it was somewhere between 3 and 5 letters per week for 16 months, 18 months. We were hearing these stories all the time, and the book was giving them language. I still get them at least weekly. So I would say that's first. The second thing is, I would say people have to be in a position of safety. They have to be in a healthy enough condition to be able to handle going forward with this, talking to the right people, because the blowback, the pushback, the gaslighting, the silencing, the reverse abuse, the re-traumatization, it's gonna happen. So they need to have a therapist. They need to have a group of people that know that they're going to go forward and that can support them when they come out of the heat of having gone to the office. The third thing I would say is, and this is a part of Pivot a little bit, is I think they need to have realistic expectations of what's going to happen when they do see abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I think they need to surrender the idea that they're going to confront the person and the person's going to change their mind. That is very rare, 10% or less. Mm-hmm. That's my guess. I'm not a scientist, but I like numbers when they help me in my case. Okay. So I'm just guessing at numbers. And they need to have the expectation of being heard. In other words, that person, that leader in the church, that elder member, that friend who's close to those in power, hears them and says, something, I think there's something here that needs to be understood. That is about as far as the expectations should go. Then I believe they need to set time limits on how long they will endure the situation. And then in many cases, they're going to have to pull up anchor and find somewhere else to go. And unfortunately, we don't live in a church in the kingdom of God in a world that always repents when the truth is made known. We don't live in that world, at least not yet. And as a result of that, we have to recognize that people are going to perceive things differently, and they're not going to respond to the same situation the same way. But then if we can get witnesses, or if we can get advocates for us, there's a strength that comes at times in having advocates that can confront the person, or at least describe the situation to the right people in a way that can be very helpful. Mm-hmm. And so those are the kinds of things that I would say, make sure you're healthy enough, find some advocates, find some friends, and have realistic expectations and set some time limits as to how long you're going to put up with this.
Yeah. Well, two of the things you said were huge in allowing me, to stand up in a case of spiritual abuse. One, I'd been seeing a therapist for a couple of years about what had been going on, and had taken the time to get healthy, because I don't think I could have done it before that. And without that, we recommend that really everybody who's been through any kind of spiritual abuse or deep church hurt see a therapist. But not just that, we recommend that every pastor proactively see a therapist just to stay healthy. But the other thing was, you talked about putting a time limit on it. And that's something that I've experienced, Scott, firsthand, as if we didn't put a time limit on it, it may still be going. Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Putting that time limit on it let us know, hey, this is where we wash our hands of it. This is where we kind of, using biblical terms, shake the dust off of our feet and move on. I agree that a lot of pastors don't do this on purpose. One of my hunches, and this is something we talk about a lot, Scott, we talk a lot about church systems and the systems that seem to cause or perpetuate or let spiritual abuse grow. And in today's modern church, there's a lot of systems that seem to do that. So I would love to hear your thoughts as a New Testament professor, someone who has studied the New Testament and what the early church looked like and what this ecclesia and gathering was supposed to look like. But you also understand the modern world and the world that we live in. What are some of those systems that you see that seem to be perpetuating, or at least fostering, allowing spiritual abuse to grow, that were never supposed to be a part of the church? Where are some places where maybe we've missed it, where we could just steer the ship back a little bit more toward what Jesus originally designed and what Jesus meant, that would allow us to combat spiritual abuse at the same time?
Systems. I think I would want to say it's systemic more than, let's say, it's methodological or method-based or system-based. And the first thing I would say is that abusers will disciple or nurture people around them that support abuse. So authoritarian people are attracted to authoritarian positions. So we have churches that have pastors who are attracted to authority. Authoritarian type people will abuse their authority. So that's systemic. Okay. Instead of attracting authoritarian leaders, I mean, after all, look, who wants platforms on Sunday morning where there are 2,000 people in front of you and you're telling them what God wants them to do with their life? Okay. Yeah. Chuck DeGroat said, he said, you and I, Scott, pastors and professors, are on the narcissistic spectrum because that's what we're doing. We're in that position. Yep. All right. Humble, quiet leaders don't want those platforms. They do everything. And not only that, they don't usually do well on those platforms. So the people who do well are the ones probably that we ought to be watching most carefully. So I think that's one. The other thing is, we do not attract character to pastoral leaderships. We attract giftedness to pastoral leadership. How many times have you seen a job description of a senior pastor? We call him senior pastor. That's a position, that's a term of authority and hierarchy. Okay. How many times have you seen a job description that is entirely based upon character? And how many times have you seen a job description based almost entirely on giftedness, with a few character traits tossed in that can't be measured, like spirit-filled? Yeah. You know? I mean, how does someone know that? And do churches, do search committees actually have people on their committees who can measure a spirit-filled person? You know, I haven't
figured out how to measure that in my own life at times, not as well as I would like to, Scott.
I often tell people that for every lawyer on a search committee. You need to have 2 psychologists to outweigh them. Because psychologists perceive human character and human nature far better than lawyers. Lawyers, they're not all alike, so I'm not going to stereotype them. But I've stereotyped it enough to say we need to be careful. So I think that we need to start measuring character and then redefine the role of a pastor away from a Sunday morning platform role to a pastoral, spiritual director, nurturing role. And then all of a sudden, we will be with Karl Vatter's desizing the church, and we will again be re-energizing the church at the local level to become people who are Christ-like and Christoform, doing the work of Jesus in their local neighborhood.
Well, a lot of the job descriptions for pastors that I see mimics more of a job description of a CEO than a pastor.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And those are very different skill sets. They're very different giftings. Spiritual abuse is terrible because it causes trauma that can linger for a lifetime. And the pain that comes with spiritual abuse, that's the kind of pain that a person can feel deep into their soul. At the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we want to stop spiritual abuse through awareness, education, research, and practical resources. You see, at SAI, we're fighting for a future where spiritual abuse is rare and really hard to hide. But we can't do this without your help. As a donor-funded nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our community for everything that we do. So, if you've been blessed or encouraged by this podcast in any way, would you consider giving a donation of any kind? Because by partnering with SAI financially, you are giving a voice to the voiceless. You're going to help more people heal from the devastating effects of spiritual abuse, and you're going to help us to challenge more churches to create safe and healthy environments for everyone. You can give a donation by clicking on the link in the description below or by visiting spiritualabuse.institute. Every gift counts, and we are hyper grateful for every donor and every supporter of this community. And hey, in May and June, we're looking specifically for 100 people who would commit to giving $1 a day to support SAI. By giving as little as $1 a day, you'll help us reach our budget for the rest of the year, and you're going to help us to get more content out, to help more people heal, and to do work with more churches who want to start doing things the right way. So if you've been impacted in any way by this content or the Church Disrupted podcast, would you consider joining the 100 for 1 campaign and becoming a financial supporter of SAI? Thank you so much for your consideration. And guys, thank you. Thank you to every single person who has already partnered with us financially. Together, we can end spiritual abuse and we can help the church become a place of hope and healing for everyone again. Speaking from just a New Testament perspective, one of the things I'm looking at right now, I'm doing kind of my own study, so I'm going to nerd out for just a minute and try to sit at your feet. But I'm trying to go through and study all of the references to pastors or to a pastor, not an overseer, but to a pastor, in the New Testament. And there's not as many references as I would think. I think a lot of times there's words that we conflate with one another. The role of a pastor just looks so much different in the New Testament from how it looks today in kind of our title-based society where we made it about a title and a position. What are the biggest differences you see as a professor in New Testament from the pastoral gifting and the pastoral title that so often we have today in churches?
Well, Eugene Peterson spent most of his career griping about this, and that's the word I use, griping. I've used it in print, and I think it's fair. He was a griper about this, and I think he was right. Is that something happened in the 80s and 90s where pastors became entrepreneurs, visionaries, leaders began to be used all the time. They began to pick up ideas about pastoral leadership from the business world, and they moved away from being theologians, teachers, pastors who nurtured people, who visited people in their homes, who visited people in the hospital, to some sort of public role that was defined by Sunday morning on the platform. And that right there has impacted the church dramatically. And I think it was in the 80s and 90s. I remember when I was a student at Trinity in the 1970s, late 70s. There was, maybe it was when I was a young professor there was a Christianity Today image that was stuck to a bulletin board. So we saw for a decade, because nobody ever cleans up the bulletin board. And it was of how a pastor should dress. And they were increasingly being dressed in a business model. And rather than, let's just say, a clerical shirt and a robe or something like that, which has been the traditional garb of a pastor when seen in public. And I think that whole strategy has impacted the church in some very negative ways. Pastors need to become people. I define this in my classes. Pastors are people who pastor people. When someone asks me, do you think I should be a pastor? I always say, who are you pastoring and who sees you as a pastor? If no one sees you as a pastor, then you're not a pastor, because pastors pastor people. Mm-hmm. And if you don't define yourself that way, if you're not pastoring someone, and if someone else doesn't define you that way, then you're not yet pastoring. It's not a job description. It's not a job that you get when you get hired, that all of a sudden you become a pastor. Pastoring is a spiritual gift that it inevitably displays itself in relationships with other people. Okay, I travel with students to Israel, to Turkey, to Greece. When we're on those trips, the pastors among the pastors stand out. Some of them are there for information. Some of them are there just to do their own thing. Others are consulted. Others are those to whom I go for information. Others are the ones that the students go to for pastoral counsel in a situation, for wisdom and advice. That's what we need to start nurturing.
Yeah. Well, I've worked in churches of all sizes, very small church plants, small, 200-year-old traditional churches, but I've also worked in a top 100 mega church. And, for a long time, Scott, my dream was to work in a mega church that was on the outreach top 100 list. I wanted to see people saved and baptized and be at the top of the industry. And I remember when I got into, the interviews to go to the church, one of the things that I noticed was there was such an emphasis on leadership that I never experienced before. And I already liked leadership and liked entrepreneurship. But I remember before I even started at this church, there was such a pressure from the interview process that I was calling experts. I was reading every book I could get my hand on because I knew I wouldn't survive if I didn't become this great leader. So one of the reasons why they liked me so much in the system was I had the entrepreneurial spirit. Okay. I was a very good teacher, very good speaker from the platform. Like you talked about a minute ago, I liked that. I thrived on that. And now thinking about thriving on that in those big rooms, that should have meant that I needed a lot more accountability around me, because that doesn't say that I'm a bad person, but it does say I'm higher on the narcissism scale and narcissism spectrum, and I've got to be careful there. So we do a lot of that with pastors today. Yet I would look back at it, Scott, and I would say I didn't have the pastoral gifting. I loved people and I wanted to serve in the church and serve the church, but my heart to pastor people was never what it should have been for that title, because I wanted to be involved in creating programs. I wanted to be involved in being on the stage more than I wanted to be sitting with people through their hurt. And it's actually over the years through my own hurt and pain that I think God has developed that pastoral heart. But I know of pastors today where, if you're going to get a meeting with them as a parishioner, you get 15 minutes only if you tithe and you serve. They can't be approached. They live in green rooms. And that feels such the opposite of what a pastor's supposed to be. So I love the way you talked about that. A pastor's not a title. A pastor is something that should crop up, that people see, something that happens out of you long before you get a title. Um, what do you think has been one of the biggest damages that's come with that we call a lot of people pastors today that just aren't pastors? So
Hmm.
it's changed the way we think about pastoral ministry. It's changed the way we think about the church. How has that damaged the way that the church views itself as parishioners?
Well, okay, I would tie this to I don't have a real good answer to this, but this is what comes to mind. What's happened is a megachurch phenomenon. We now have all these churches that are really big. That is basically a spectator sport in the sense that people
Mm,
come to enjoy amazing music, amazing talks, all kinds of inspirational stuff, resources up the gazoo, and then they go eat somewhere or they go out with their friends and they go throughout the rest of their week. They don't even, I mean, I saw someone the other day, I think it was either on my Substack or on Twitter. I saw something, maybe it's Facebook. They go to a mega church because they can go to church and no one knows who they are and they can leave and no one bothers them. Okay, that's a phenomenon that has been created, I think, in a very unusual way. Now, I know there were big churches
mhm.
prior to the megachurch phenomenon, but that impact has created more and more pastors who are distant from people and whose role is performance. And I remember when we were attending a megachurch, I remember thinking, if I were to die, who would care for my family? And I'll be honest with you, I didn't think there would be anybody who would. And I thought, this is not right. And so to me is, um, I think we have to ask this question in a slightly different way. We have to ask, who is your pastor right now? And who sees themselves as your genuine pastor? And if there is no one who does that, find another church. That's what I would say. I don't
Yeah.
think, I think we have punted on the pastoral calling and it's become a performance calling.
Yeah. Goodness, that is strong, Scott. Thank you so much. We're actually doing a series as we come into the summer where we're going to look at the church that celebrities built. And we're looking at a lot of those things because celebrity culture has built a very different church than what has existed, for thousands of years before that. But I want to go back. I've got a couple more questions because I want to honor your time. We talked about a couple of things that happened in the 80s, the kind of early mid 80s. There were some big shifts in church culture. So we talked about kind of the business and leadership shift. That was when mega churches really started taking off. And we had, a mega church model really start taking off from my perspective. But another thing happened in the 80s, I would love your perspective on. In the probably mid to late 80s, there almost became a playbook that was created, not just for mega churches, but churches in scandal or leaders in scandal, especially as we had a lot of televangelists, fall into scandal. And there was kind of a playbook where you deny and you evade and you blame shift and you attack the victims and you just stop talking. You spin a narrative and you won't talk about anything but your narrative. There's a lot of different pieces of it that I've seen over the years. It feels like to me that more churches than not are still using that same playbook to address scandal that existed in the 80s. And it does not work in any way today. It wasn't healthy then, but at least it worked. Today, it seems to make things worse as churches can a lot of times refuse to actually talk about the elephant in the room, refuse to own up to any accountability. So when you think about what you perceive as the kind of modern day church playbook that is used more often than not to address scandal, what are the pieces of that playbook? What are the plays you see them running? And how would you suggest that needs to change for us to really be the church?
Well, social media has changed everything on this. Social
Mm,
media has made the capacity to not tell the truth impossible. Eventually, the story is going to be told.
mm,
So to me, that playbook of the old days is not going to work. It's going to, you have to change to telling the truth, immediately recognizing the significance of victims, and the truthfulness of their stories, very few lie, and start from that process of putting people on the shelf and going through the process of analyzing what truly took place. The Call it the 80s playbook. The 80s playbook will not play in the 2020s. That's the only thing I could say.
Hey Disruptors, have you heard about the Church Disrupted community? It's an online community for Church Disrupted listeners where you can ask questions, you can connect and talk with other like-minded people who've experienced church hurt and spiritual abuse, and you can ask honest and vulnerable questions without judgment of any kind. And that's without the trolls, the anger, and the constant arguments that tend to come with social media. And the best part is it's 100% free because of our gracious and generous donors. So, if you've experienced church hurt, spiritual abuse, or religious trauma of any kind and you're on the healing journey, I want to invite you to join me in the Church Disrupted community. You can join at disrupted.church or spiritualabuse.institute. And we're also including a link below where you can join just through the description. So, what are you waiting for? Join the Church Disrupted community for free today. We can't wait to meet you. All right. Well, one of the last questions I want to ask you, you and I have talked about this a little bit via email, a little bit before we hit record today. But you got a little bit of a project you're working on. Not sure if it's going to be a book yet. It could be a couple of books. It could be just something you're talking about, on Substack. But we talked about the other side of abuse, and that's something that doesn't get enough airtime. And I can say that as someone who's experienced abuse at the hands of pastors and the megachurch system, but I've also experienced abuse as a pastor at a small traditional church from, deacons and parishioners. But the truth is there are a lot of pastors who go through spiritual abuse and never really have a way to talk about it. There's the wounded shepherd who gets abused. And unfortunately, I tend to think that leads probably, Scott, to a lot of abuse later on because we want to protect ourselves from what we've experienced. Can you talk a little bit about what you see on the other side of abuse and how pastors experience spiritual abuse?
Well, I am working on a little project called The Traumatized Apostle. I'm working with a trauma therapist named Adrian, and we're working on a book together called The Trauma-Informed Church. But in the process, in studying trauma theory and what trauma is, I became convinced that the Apostle Paul was traumatized by the Corinthian church, or at least by leaders in the Corinthian church. And so I think 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13 is a letter, or is a section in the letter that describes Paul, or Paul talks about things as a person who's been traumatized. He lashes out. He's been accused of all sorts of things. He responds to them. He gets sarcastic. And in studying trauma theory, I became convinced that Paul himself was traumatized. So I think we can learn from this that congregations sometimes can become the asymmetrical, stronger power that can manipulate pastors into becoming the sort of person that they want, and if not, they fire them. And they become traumatized. Now, I have lots of stories of at least associate pastors, if not senior pastors, who've been traumatized by congregations. So it works both ways. And my struggle right now, Jeff, as my battery is about to run down, my struggle right now is I am for victims. Most victims that I have dealt with have been victims of pastoral abuse. But I also see pastors at times as victims, and therefore I want to side with them as well. So I'm not trying to play two sides of the game. It's not like I'm trying to give pastors reasons to think that they're not the problem, or congregations reasons to think that they're not the problem. I want to recognize that abuse can work in both directions. And so right now, that's something I'm researching and working on. And 1 hour ago, I was texting with a publisher about this. So it's pretty fresh in my mind right now.
Yeah. Well, a very wise person by the name of Laura Barringer said there should only really be one side that we ever care about. That's the side of the truth. And I think that's what is really driving this for you. It's the side of the truth. And the truth is that both pastors and parishioners go through abuse, go through trauma. And when we go through trauma without healing and we don't do our best to protect people from trauma, that always hurts the church. And it really always hurts everybody that the church comes in contact with. And eventually it hurts every person on the planet. So it's important that we become trauma informed. It's important that we understand how to handle these things and to protect people, whether they have the title of a pastor or whether they're a parishioner. So thank you so much for speaking out about that. And I'm looking forward to however this looks when the Traumatized Apostle comes out. I'm looking forward to that. We're doing some work with church staffs on how they can be trained to become trauma informed. So I'm very excited about that work. Scott, I'm grateful for you, grateful for your time, grateful for all of your work. Guys, I hope you've learned as much from this episode, from this interview, as I have. I've learned a ton from Scott. And Scott, anytime I encounter your work, whether it's your writing, you on Substack, you on Twitter, another book, or a moment like this, I always learn something. I hope that you've learned something as well. And we're praying over each of you as you're walking through different parts of your own journey. Just know you're not alone. Know that we see you, know that we love you. No more than anything, Jesus sees you and he loves you. So until next time, grace and peace, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast.